TexasRealFast.com. Today we're working on an 03 Hyundai Sonata with a 2.4 engine. Came in because it wouldn't start. It would crank but it wouldn't start. Now in this video we're actually going to focus on the crank sensor, but what I want to show you first is the steps we took to get there. The first thing we wanted to do is make sure that the coils were firing. We've got this partially tore apart, so I'm going to show you how we determined that there was good spark. After we did the compression check and we knew we had 200 pounds of compression in each cylinder, we basically pulled the coil out, took just an extra spark plug wire, put it down there on the spark plug. We use this adjustable spark plug gap tester where you can actually screw it down. Now what I like to do is start at 20 kV and then go up to 30. If it'll jump 30 kV, then you have a good coil. So we ran it up to 30 kV, plug that in here, we'll put this on this end, and we stick that up into the coil. Then we crank the engine, and we could see the spark jumping here, 30 kV, which tells us that there's plenty of spark to ignite that fuel. Now sometimes you can test everything, but sometimes you can take some things for granted. When we pulled the spark plugs out, there was fuel in the cylinders and they were very fouled out with fuel. So we were taking the assumption here that the fuel injectors were squirting fuel.
Since we verified that we've got the fuel with the plugs being wet, we verified we got fire sparking at the coil. Wanted to verify that our cam to crank timing was correct. We removed the top cover, took number 1 plug out. We have a wire about the equivalent of a little thicker than a coat hanger. Run it down in number 1 hole. Put your wrench on the crankshaft. Slowly rotate the crankshaft. That'll cause this piston to push this rod up. When the rod finds its top dead center, if you go past that, the rod will drop. Go past the other way, the rod will drop. So you verify that you have top dead center. Look at your markings on your cams. Since this is a dual overhead cam, you'll have exhaust and intake. Verify the timing on that was correct.
Now that's not an exact way of finding out the timing. You could go through, take the timing cover off and all that and check your timing marks, but this is a way of doing it without having to do that, so we can kind of zero in on what our real problem is. So we know we've got good compression. We know we've got good spark. We're assuming here that we've got good fuel. And we know our timing is at least very, very close, if not right on. So the next thing we want to verify here is the crank signal. Now that we suspect the crank signal, we're going to use our lab scope and actually check the crank signal and the cam signal. Now our crank signal is mounted down in between the timing belt, but the wire comes up here. It's a 3-wire sensor. If you look at the electrical diagram, there's power and ground and the signal wire. We used a power probe to determine which one of these had the 12 volts and which one was the ground, and we determined then that our blue wire is the signal wire, so we've tapped into that for the crank sensor. At the cam sensor we did the same thing. It's got power, ground, and the signal wire. We identified which one was the signal wire and we're tapped into that. In the signature test, it tells us that this should be a square wave. It should be a nice, clean, up and down, on and off square wave. Now from here we're going to go to view our meter. When the meter comes on, you'll see we're tapped into both signals, but we're only reading the yellow. Now at the top, I've got the crank signal on the yellow and the cam sensor on the red. So I'm reading the yellow, drag that up here a little bit. Now the red I need to turn on, so I'm going to go to traces, go to trace 4, which is the red, and display that. Now I've got the red as well. So we can actually look at both signals. Now we're going to start the car. Now before I start, I want to show you what our trace is set at. We're set at 20 volts. We're going to leave that there. And we've got a sweep set at 500 milliseconds. We're going to leave that there. Now we're going to crank the engine. Now I'm going to freeze that, and there you can see the signal. Again, the yellow is the crank, the red is the cam. Now this should be a good clean. Now this is a pretty good signal up on here, but if you look at these crank signals, that's an on, but it doesn't know exactly when it is shut off. On, but it doesn't know when it's shut off. That's a very disturbed signal on that. Now I'm going to unfreeze this, and I'm going to change my sweep. Let's go down to 2 seconds, where we can see more of it. Okay. Now here's a 2-second interval. You can see the crank signal. It is not clean. We've got disturbance at the top. Those are not good, but the worst part of this signal is this area right in here. Let me move this so we can see it. When you freeze this like that, you can actually move your signal back and forth because it's a still frame now. But you can see these aren't good. They're not terrible, but these right here, there's no way this engine's going to run with a crank signal like that. Now even the cam sensor has some disturbance in it, but it probably still would be able to determine when to squirt the fuel. So we know we've got a bad crank sensor. We've got evidence of that. So now we're going to put in a crank sensor, and we'll show you what the signal should look like with a good one. Okay, now we've got the crank sensor replaced. We're going to start the car. Okay, we'll shut the car off. We froze this image. Now you can see this is with the car actually running. Now we've got a good clean on signal. We're reading 0 volts. It's going all the way to ground. We're going up to, the min-max is showing up going up to 5.91. So that's the highest it's got here. So we got a good clean on signal, good clean off. We're going to 0, so we got a good clean ground, and we got a good power signal. As I move this across, you can see this is with the engine running. That's where we started the car, and this is with it idling. Now I just want to show you a couple comparisons here. We're going to close this. Now I'm going to go back on my Veris. I can save a lot of stuff here. I'm going to go back into my screenshots and show you some of those captures that we had. Now this is with the crank signal replaced, the new crank signal, and cranking. Now here's a screen capture of before we changed the crank signal, or with the bad crank sensor. And if you look at this, we did not have clean ons, we did not have clean offs, and we had this real disrupted signal. But you can also see that over in here, if you go over to the yellow trace, which this one is, go to the yellow numbers. Because see, this is the red trace, you refer to the red numbers. So going to the yellow numbers over here, you see that we rarely went all the way to ground. Most of the time it was up in here in the off position. We never went to ground. Follow that over there? Over here this was the signal off, but it never went to ground. Ground should have went way down here at this point. Now let's go to the new signal, the new crank sensor. Now this is the new crank sensor. I've got the sweep different because the engine was running. But as you can see here, we've got good clean ons, power cross, good clean offs, and we're going to ground. You can see that we're going to ground every time. Now every once in a while you're going to see a few little aberrant tracks in here. Those are okay. They're not really going to cause a problem. With the old sensor in there, the computer never saw it going all the way to ground, or rarely saw it going all the way to ground. That's why it wouldn't start and run. So when you're diagnosing cars, you have lots of information available to you. The trick is gathering that information. Gather your information, look for the evidence, and the evidence will lead you to the problem. There was actually 2 problems with this vehicle. We just showed you the crank sensor, which is why it wouldn't start. But prior to us getting the car, it had some pretty serious backfiring going on. Someone had used some ether, and if you look right in here, we had to replace the mass airflow sensor. And this is what happens when you have some ether, starting fluid, and a backfire all taking place at the same time. So you need to be very careful when you're using ether or starting fluid.